Hi, Chris. Welcome to the show. It's a pleasure having you here. It is
It's,
so nice to see you.
it's nice to see you again. It's great to be here. I appreciate the time.
Oh my gosh. Yes, thank you. No, this is a topic that, I think that I only really know from the surface, I should say. Like, I am not super well versed in all of the specifics and the details regarding addiction and substance abuse and mental health and all of that. So, to be able to speak to someone who is such an expert and also someone who's really able to help others who are going to be listening is a blessing. So, the pleasure is really mine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I always appreciate the opportunity to, to help share and educate, whether it's through personal experience or, the education, my professional background. I think it's important that, people understand, and that people see examples of people such as myself who have, come out on the other side of that and been successful and able to navigate life on life's terms and not have to worry about this overshadowing thing that some people view constantly as this struggle. And so I think as we kind of get into some things, one of the hopes that I want to bring is that people understand it's absolutely not a struggle. I live a life free from addiction, and my mental health is at the probably at the best that it's ever been. And it is not a this burden that I have to carry day in and day out. I'm not weighed down by this constant obsession and these things. And people don't have to tiptoe around me, and I'm responsible for my own behaviors. And in short, I can go where any free man can go today and not have to worry about those things. And so I think at the end of the day, what I want people to understand is that those things are possible, even though it may not feel that way, in their current state, if they're struggling with, whether it's chemical dependency or other addictions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that so much. And you said something just a second ago. It's really about relatability, because people want someone to be able to relate to, someone who's been down the path, who's walked through the
Yeah.
fire and has
Yeah.
come out the other side. And so I think that that helps so much when getting the help or looking for the resources that they need,
Yeah.
because they're able to see that it's possible, and so someone like yourself is just a perfect representation of that. And so yeah, it's fascinating. And you have quite a story, which we're going to get into right
Sure.
now, because that's where I want to
Yeah.
start. I want to give our listeners a little bit of an idea of, why you're doing what you're doing, why you're now working with people who have been struggling with addiction and substance abuse,
Yeah.
where, I know there's a pocket and a niche of people that you're working with, which is just amazing. So take us back a little bit and share with us sort of your story.
Sure. And I think as we get into this, it's important that people understand, because there are some things about my story that include my parents, and I don't blame my parents for any of the things that happened when I was a kid, any of the challenges that occurred in my life as I got older, and I certainly don't hold them responsible for my addictions and the things that happened later in life. They're both still alive, and so if they hear this, they need to know that I don't blame them at all for anything. I share these pieces of my story because I think it's important that people understand, part of healing from addiction is, moving through these traumas in life. So I think the beginning of it really kind of starts with the fact that, my mom was very young when I was born. She was, 16 going on 17. And, I'm Gen X, so it's one of those things where that piece of it, if you can understand at 16 or 17 years old, what it must be like to be responsible for another human being, And so it was a different time. She didn't have a lot of support from her mom, unfortunately. There was some, but not, what my mom would have needed for things to turn out differently. That's for sure. My dad left when I was very young, so he was not around. And so again, I think that's, those choices that they made, I believe, were really them doing the best that they could with what they had. My dad certainly had his own troubles as a kid growing up. So, and my mom, didn't necessarily get the guidance and support that she needed from my grandmother. So, I think they did the best they could with what they had. But at 16 or 17 years old, you can only imagine what that was like. So as I got later on into life, into my teenage years, unfortunately, my mom developed her own addictions, and um, it would bring an environment into my life that would expose me to a lot of things very early on. And I think it's also important to understand that as I preference these things and kind of outline how my addiction started, these things weren't the reason I became alcoholic or addicted, right? They were contributing factors to, which meant I was exposed to things early on that made them more accessible to me. And so, at 15, 16 years old, when my mom's dealing with her own addiction, and I have a younger brother that I more or less raised for long periods of time, because, my mom was a single mom and she was working, and we were latchkey kids. For those of you guys who don't know what that is, we ran around with our house keys on our neck legitimately, and we walked back and forth to school. And it was kind of one of those things where you unlocked the door, you locked the door behind you, you picked up the phone, you called your mom at work and let her know that you got home. And so being raised that way, there was not a lot of supervision. And I mentioned that my dad wasn't around, so there wasn't a lot of male influence. And so those things would take a lot of toll on my life later on. And so fast forward, at 15, 16 years old, not a lot of supervision. Um, Back up a little bit. I was probably about 12 or 13 when I started experimenting with drugs and alcohol. And, at that point in time, it was just, drinking a few beers with the high school kids across the street, or smoking some weed that I found, in a dresser drawer somewhere, and just kind of experimenting with some things. And having been exposed to this lifestyle around people, um, that weren't the most productive members of society, it brought on a lot of feelings of insecurities and confusions, and just a lack of not belonging, and so we were extremely poor. My mom did the best that she could, but we didn't always have everything that we needed, and so that too made it difficult, when you're in junior high and in high school, and you don't have the in shoes, or the sweatshirts, or whatever it is. It can be difficult, and so you find yourself feeling left out, or not part of, or insecure about whatever's going on. Um, and so experimenting with drugs and alcohol really introduced me to this feeling that I had never felt before, right? Immediately after drinking, I felt different than I had ever felt in my life, right? The very first time I ever drank was a couple of kids across the street got a hold of some 40-ounce bottle of Old English 800, which is horrible. I do not suggest
Do
anybody
not
drink it.
do not
Yeah.
recommend.
Do not drink the 40s and OE, folks.
No.
It's not good. And so, it was this immediate feeling of relief and acceptance. And in short, I felt faster, stronger, smarter, funnier, better looking. I mean, all of these things that just really had me attracted to that feel. And
Mm,
so, not having the social skills, not having the all of the things needed to kind of guide me through life, that felt like something that I really wanted to be part of more and more. And you know with that sort of environment that I was raised in, I also brought up in a very, kind of rough side of town, North Long Beach here in California, for those of you who don't know. So I was, one of five white kids in the school. And so there was those difficulties, and there was just a lot of challenges that came with the environment that I was raised up in. And drugs and alcohol early on offered me this relief. It offered me this place to be. And when I could find this group of kids that were interested in doing the same things, and I could get these feelings of belonging and, just relief, just to be out of the state of mind that I was in and feeling like I belonged. Um, it became very apparent to me at that age that this was something that I would, try to seek out at every opportunity. And again, being in the environment that I was in, it wasn't difficult to do that. You know, I could find it, it was accessible. And so that's what I did. And fast forward, I about 17 years old, I had a younger brother who sought my dad out and found my dad, and who was living in Tennessee at the time. And he went out to stay with my dad and contacted me. And shortly after that, I went out to meet my dad for the first time.
Mhm.
And this was a different lifestyle, in Tennessee, where um, he had his own problems with drinking, and he was one of those parents that thought, well, if you're going to, I know you're going to drink, you're 17 years old, and if you're going to do that, you're going to do that here under my supervision, right? Where parents think like this is a better way to manage your kids.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was the greatest thing ever. And I would begin, on the weekends, um, we would be at my house, and um, we would drink.
Mhm.
And for me, that started the continuous cycle of being able to drink when I wanted to drink. And at 16, 17, 18 years old, you know, I was drinking constantly. And then things became very abusive with my dad. Him and I had a lot of physical altercations. And so at 17, almost 18 years old, I left home. I dropped out of school, and I would begin working construction work. And with that comes a paycheck, and construction workers like to drink. And I was a young construction worker. And so I began to drink and experiment with other drugs. And that would lead me to, just a lot of self destruction, um, because of my inability to manage my emotions at a young age, because of I was just never taught those things. And then the abuse with my dad and my insecurities, I became a very angry and violent person. So when I would drink, I would find myself getting in trouble and getting in fights and driving cars and doing all of these things that would, you know, start to wind me up in jail. And that went on for a lot of years. It went on for a lot of years. And so it was just this vicious cycle. And, at when you start drinking early on and doing drugs at that age, you just never mature. And so I continued this cycle, a vicious cycle of drugs and alcohol and, the abuse and all of these things, and these continuous cycles of being incarcerated and getting out. And eventually, it would lead me to a path where I would get into harder drugs. And I moved back out to California somewhere in 2000. And my drug addiction really picked up then. And again, just a continuous cycle of in and out, getting in trouble, being put on probation, just all of the things that come with living that lifestyle.
Right. Right.
And so it would be, again, this continuous thing. And when you're caught in the throes of addiction like that, to people on who don't understand, it just appears that you're somebody who likes to party, um, who doesn't necessarily want to play by the rules, or at times even care.
Yeah.
And I think what people need to understand is that there comes a point in addiction where you lose your free will, right? Like, what person in their rational mind would want to continue living like this. I mean, eventually to the point where I'm not working anymore. I've lost every job that I have. I'm on probation. I'm more or less homeless, living from couch to couch, and eventually ending up on the streets for short periods of time. You have to ask yourself, who would choose to do that? And they weren't choices that I was consciously making, right? These weren't things that I thought, hey, what's a really good idea to do with my life? Let's just run it into the ground and keep running it into the ground and eventually end up with no support from your family, no job, no home, no direction in life, living and feeling every single day this just helpless and hopeless feeling of, I was never a person who was suicidal,
Mm.
um, but I was definitely a person who didn't want to live. It was this idea, not necessarily that I wanted to take my own life, but the idea more so that I could not continue to live and feel the way that I was feeling.
Yeah.
There comes a point when you're disappointed in the fact that you have lied and manipulated people in your life, but you're even more disappointed when it's your own self that you're lying and manipulating to. There were many days in during the throes of my addiction where I would tell myself like, "No, I'm not going to do it again. I'm not going to do it today."
Yeah.
You know, um and I meant it. I meant it. I did not want to do those things, and yet I still found myself with this inability to control when the drugs came calling or the alcohol came calling. Um, I just didn't have the ability to stop. I had
Yeah.
lost power of choice.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's it in a nutshell. I could certainly go into, details on all that stuff. I don't necessarily believe that they're important. I think, you understand that, um, again, the environment isn't the end all be all that got me to where I was. The environment was something that offered opportunity faster. What eventually would lead me to addiction, and we'll talk about this later on, is there's a genetic component to what happens when alcohol is introduced to my body. I
Right.
don't process alcohol the same as somebody else. So if we revisit that very first time that I drank with, several other young kids, we have these big bottles of beer and we're drinking and I'm watching them, and they get this much and they're laughing and they're joking and they're feeling all these effects. And I'm looking around and I don't feel it, right?
Right.
I'm not there. And so I drink more and I drink more. And I'm not trying to drink more. I'm trying to feel like everybody else. And it's just not happening for me.
Yeah.
Right. And I learned later on that I have this what's called a genetic low response, right? Which sets me up in a way to become much more tolerant and need more alcohol.
Hmm.
But eventually, when it does hit me, that feeling is surreal. It's not like a quote unquote normal person, and we'll get into that later, but
Yes. Yes, we
it
will.
it just affects me differently. It opens up a whole nother world, right?
Yeah.
It's like it's like somebody going to the county fair, right? You go to the county fair, you get in there, you're looking around, it's a pretty good time, and you're thinking, hey, this isn't bad. You eat some fried food, whatever it is, ride a few sketchy rides, and it's a good time, right? But then you go to Disneyland or Six Flags, right? Or one of these big amusement parks, and you're like, oh my
Mm.
God, this
This
is
is
what
where
it
it's at. Yeah. This is
yes.
where it's at. Yeah.
And that is alcohol for me as opposed to alcohol for the normal person. The
Yeah.
way that it affects me and the way that I feel is much more different, and it instantaneously turns this thing on within me, and my brain says, I gotta have more, I gotta keep feeling this way.
Yeah. It's essentially how your body is and brain is metabolizing it, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I love that you're already ahead, and I love it because we that is really what we're going to first kind of dive in, because that was one of my first questions to pose to you, is this genetic component that I don't think a lot of people are aware of.
Yeah.
But I want to rewind just for a second. First of all, the very first thing I want to say is this: I am so grateful that you are so open in sharing your story,
Yeah.
because it is, even with all of the years that have passed, this is such a, it's so, it's so real. And I'm sure there are people listening that, they are feeling so much relatability, and there's emotions that are being brought up, right? There's even
Of
emotions
course.
still that are brought up in you. I mean, I could,
Yes.
I'm watching you, and I'm feeling it as well. And so I just want to say thank you, like genuinely
Of course.
thank you for sharing it and being so vocal and vulnerable, because that's not easy. As long, even if you do it, even if you've been doing it, right, it still takes,
Yeah.
it takes a emotionally intelligent kind of effort, if that even makes sense.
It
Does
makes
that, I don't even.
complete sense. No, it makes
Yeah.
sense. Yeah. And
um
I think it's important too, right? That people know that, when I talk about that helpless and hopeless state of
yeah,
mind and
yeah,
body, right? That sheer powerlessness, to visit that place that I once was, it's not so much going back there as much as it is the emotion that comes up is the gratitude that I have
yes,
where where I am today.
yeah, yeah, and I can see it, I could feel it. um I I know and knew, actually, when you were speaking about your story, and I could see the emotional change, and hear it, that that's where it's coming from. Uh it's coming from this blessed place. It's coming from,
100%.
oh, I
Yeah.
just got the chills. It's coming
Yeah.
from, look at how far I've come. Look at how far God, we're going to get into this. Look at how far God has brought me. And
100%.
it's just, it moves me in a really special kind of a way. So I just, first of all, wanted to say thank you. The second thing that I wanted to say, and we are going to get into this also, is that I felt like it was so critical that you touched on two points, which is, number one, um, that you weren't consciously choosing
Yes.
this anymore, right? There was a conscious choice in the beginning to some degree, but there's a switch that happens. And we're going to get into that. And then the inability to manage your emotions was also so heavily, and is so heavily, tied to this. That it really is the root, right? Um,
100%.
because it's all based on things that started long ago. And how these patterns just kind of develop, but there's just so much underneath that I think that people who are both in an addiction situation and those who are, supporting somebody or live with somebody, really needs to understand. And so I'm really, really looking forward to getting into this, because uh, I just think there needs to be a lot of clarity for those who are not really either familiar, or they're struggling, or they're having a hard time with a loved one. Um, so, with that said, you started to touch on it.
Yeah.
There are so many, I should say, like, for me, I look at it as frequently asked questions, right? Like, what would I want to ask you about the situation from a holistic perspective? Because that's what we're doing. We're doing this show because we're looking at addiction and substance abuse and mental health as a whole pie, a whole piece, right? There's all these facets to it. And we're going to look at the physical, we're going to look at the mental and emotional, and then we're going to look at the spiritual. And then we're going to get into the next steps if somebody is, possibly suffering or being challenged, I should say, and or family members as well, loved ones, spouses,
Yeah.
siblings, friends. So back to the physical, where you were going. Let's talk about the fact that there is actually a predisposition or a genetic component, and how this came to be seen in your life. And I think that this is tied to where things started to turn for you. So, if you can give us just a very brief summary of when things started to shift and how you were able to learn this, because I think it's important that people hear the shift too that happened for you. Yeah. So, go for
Yeah.
it.
And so I think it's important to understand, right? Make no qualms about it. When someone is in the throes of addiction, it is suffering. It is 100% suffering, because there's this conflict of not wanting to continue doing the things that you're doing, and the inability to not, the inability to stop.
Yeah.
And so what happens, a lot of people may not understand that it's this progressive thing, right? And I think that's also what makes it so difficult to understand. There's two things that really make it difficult to understand. One, it's so related to pleasure that people all the time or often feel like people are just doing it because they like it. People are just
Mm.
doing it because they're the party person. They're just doing it because they want to, right? And while that's not necessarily untrue, there becomes a point for someone who becomes addicted or has that genetic predisposition. There comes a point when it's not a choice, and it's this progressive thing over time. So as you begin to experiment, right, there's this experimental phase where you feel like, you're just kind of experimenting. It's Let's not overthink it, right? Like, you're experimenting, and it oftentimes starts for people very young.
Mm.
Not everyone, but most people start pretty young, experimenting, whether it's a sip of somebody's wine or a sneaking a beer here or there, right? Finding a cigarette, a joint, whatever it is, right? A pill. People start experimenting pretty early on, and there's this experimental phase where people are just kind of trying to figure out what they like. You'll hear people say, "Oh, I drank, a beer, and oh my god, it was the worst feeling I'd ever felt, and the horrible. It tasted horrible. I never touched another one." Okay, right, but that same person may very well be addicted to cigarettes or other things. Maybe alcohol just wasn't the thing, or maybe they don't have an issue with it at all, and they're that person who just doesn't drink. So be it. Or they go on later on to drink normally within their life. But for someone like myself, it's this phase of where you're just trying this and you're trying that until all of a sudden you find the combination of things, or you find the one thing that you're like, "Oh," right? Like, this is
Yeah.
this is it. This
Yeah.
is the thing. I love the way that this makes me feel. And the brain, right, starts producing chemicals and locking on to this. When we understand that the brain and the body work together, and the brain's job is to create this state of homeostasis and work in pushing down stress and doing these things. And when someone like myself is super anxious all the time, stressed out, right? Um, and has this inability and to manage emotion, and is super insecure, and you find this elixir, right? This magic potion that makes you feel better, the brain immediately says, "Remember that.
Mm.
Remember that." Because the brain is very efficient and it wants to get a job done really quickly. And so rather than trying to do it internally, the brain says, "Remember this, because the next time I feel mad, the next time I feel glad, the next time I feel sad, the next time I feel stressed, the next time I fill in the blank, we're going to get a hold of this," right? And so this creates that habitual pattern, right? I'm experimenting, and then I move into this idea of like seeking the mood swing. I'm seeking to feel the way that the drugs or the alcohol make me feel. At any moment of feeling anything other than what I want to feel, in other words, if I'm feeling anxious and I'm like, "I don't want to feel anxious," the brain goes, "Hey, remember that stuff?
Yeah.
That stuff helped you out. Let's go get it." So now the brain is seeking the mood swing, seeking to feel other than, what it wants to feel.
It's seeking safety
Yes.
too. But it's
Yes.
like, but it's not the safety we actually need. You know,
Right.
it's. I just did a show on that's going to be coming out this week on chronic pain, and chronic symptoms. And
Yeah.
the premise of this is the exact same thing, right? It patternizes and it seeks safety, even if it's producing something that's unwanted in our life,
Yeah.
right? It's the same thing.
100%.
Yeah.
And, it doesn't stop to think forward about the consequences later on, especially when you're 14, 15 years old,
Yep.
right? And so as you begin to do this for prolonged periods of time, it rewires the brain. The brain is rewired, right? And you're not operating in the frontal cortex part of your brain. You're not operating in this rational part of the brain, the part of the brain that is responsible for creating memories, creating emotion, creating relationships, and making rational decisions. In addiction, there's this piece of the brain that flips into the mid part of the brain. In addiction, there's a, and I don't want to get too much into the kind of the science of things. There's a great film, and it'll come to me here in a minute, but
It'll come back to you.
yeah, and it really explains kind of the workings of the brain, and there is a kind of a governor between the mid part of the brain, which is responsible for survival, fight or flight, feed or breed, those things, right? What some refer to as the lizard brain.
Hmm.
Okay. And that part of the brain is still very much alive and active in human beings today. It's what's kept us alive for all of these years. But it's called the ventral tegmental, the VTA, and it's like a governor to the brain. And it basically tells the mid part of the brain, hey, you're not allowed to make decisions because the decisions that the mid part of the brain, the very dark part of the brain, make are the same decisions that say, do I fight this thing? Do I kill this thing? Do I breed with this thing? Or do I run from this thing? It's not attached to emotion. It just doesn't have an emotional part to it, and that that ventral tegmental is a governor. It keeps the mid part of the brain in check and tells it that it can't make decisions. When someone flips to full addiction, that top down control fails.
Mm.
And what happens is addiction enters the mid part of the brain and it hijacks the brain and it tells the brain that drugs or alcohol are needed for survival over food, over water, over procreation, over shelter. It is at the number one spot. And at all costs, the brain is telling the body that we will die without it.
Yeah.
And so that's a progressive thing. It doesn't happen overnight. And when you look at somebody who has gone through this experimental phase into seeking this mood swing and eventually into powerlessness, it's usually a long period of time that goes by. On average, by the time somebody realizes that they have a problem and they actually get professional help, it can be anywhere between 10 and 12 years.
Yeah.
So we know that this is a progressive thing. And during that progression, there's often periods of time where people are trying to manage it, they're trying to control it. Things happen that they understand, hey, this was bad. I way overdrank that night. I made a complete fool out of myself. My wife is really upset at me. I'm gonna stop drinking for a little while and, make the apologies, make the amends. I'll start going to the gym. I'll start doing whatever it is I need to do. We'll get back into church, whatever it is. Maybe a month goes by and they're feeling really good about the progress that they've made. And they go to a barbecue and they say, hey, you know what? I've been doing really good for a long time. And let's just have a beer. And that beer turns into one, it turns into two. And now we find ourselves back into this habit or this pattern.
The cycle.
Right. Yep, and this stuff goes on for long periods of time before somebody eventually really loses control to the point where now they're hiding, they're lying, they're manipulating, they're doing all of these things. But that's really, the brain has been hijacked and it's been rewired and it's making decisions that we are not necessarily in control of.
Would you say that everyone who deals with addiction or substance abuse has a predisposition or a genetic component?
No, I if you look at the statistics, I think they say probably about 10% of people.
Hmm.
But the way that I look at it, right, is this. So, I work with a lot of people, and they'll say, "Well, I don't think I'm an alcoholic," and I'll say, "Okay, well, that's not for me to decide. That's something that you'll have to decide on your own. My job is just to present you with information to help you, come to that decision." Well, let me ask you this, right? Has drinking caused problems? Well, I mean, yeah, I guess so. Okay. So that which causes a problem is a problem. Would you agree? Yes. You have a drinking problem, right? Do we have to go into the depths of you're an alcoholic who's the 10% of people who are truly addicted, who suffers from the mental obsession and the spiritual malady and those things? Or are you a person who has this real, drinking problem and can't manage life without drinking? So let's look at that, and let's look at how we manage those pieces, right? So there are various phases of alcoholic drinking, so to speak. There's the true alcoholic, there's the problem drinker, there's the binge drinker, right? So you look at people like that. Let's take binge drinkers for instance, right? Are they alcoholic? Listen, I'm not necessarily attached to the label. It says you got to say you're an alcoholic, and all those things. Let's take a look at the patterns and how you drink, right? You take a look at a binge drinker who oftentimes can hold it together for weeks and sometimes months at a time, but then there's these periods of time where they're just drinking, a big amount of alcohol, maybe they're mixing pills, they're still having consequences in their lives, right? As a result of the way that they drink, the patterns in which they drink. You take problem drinkers. Again, those are the people who maybe they manage, right? Maybe they function okay. They're high functioning people. Are they alcoholic? Again, I'm not one that says you got to put this label on you, but let's look at cause and effect. Let's look
Right.
at the things that are happening as a result of the patterns of your drinking. Can you stop? Most people will say, absolutely. Okay. Can you stay stopped?
Hmm.
That's the
Hmm.
big question.
And this whole explanation right here kind of parallels a question that I was going to ask, which is, what would you say to those that are so high functioning, which I think is a lot of who you probably
Mhm,
consult with and work with?
mhm.
What would you say when there's really no issues that are posing, right? Like they might just have this real regular habitual thing, maybe a drink every night, but they're not getting behind the wheel. There's like this undercurrent of dependency, but there's not really any like your blinding problems that are occurring in
Yeah.
life, but there's definitely something dependent about it. So, what would you say to that?
I think when you look at, right, I mean, first and foremost, what we have to understand is if we're going to identify a quote unquote problem, a
Mhm.
person has to be in the mindset of even seeing that there is a challenge, that there is a problem. And so we have to help somebody understand the reasons why there may be a problem. You may have somebody who says, you know what, I work, I'm a really high functioning person. I get up every day. I'm disciplined. I do all of the things necessary to take care of myself. I bring home, the money. I take care of my family. They have everything that they need. And at the end of the day, if I want to have a glass of wine, I should be able to have a glass of wine. Okay, I'm not going to argue with you. That if a person is doing that and there's no consequence in their life, and it's just a position or a place that they're at in their life, so be it. You know, but it is when you begin to look at those patterns and a person starts to question, what is the alcohol serving? What is it doing? And
Mm.
can you find something else to replace it? Can you not have that glass of wine and find another way to relax? Can you not have those, few beers or whatever it is that you're doing every night? Um, and let's just look at the impact that that's having. And what we'll find most of the time with high functioning people is oftentimes they aren't the one who recognizes that there's a challenge. It's the people around them that are saying, yeah, you know what, you don't see it but we do, and
Yep.
here's what we see, right? We see that you are absolutely not engaged in life around you. Yes, you do get up and you do all of the things, right? And that person typically looks out and says, look at my life. I have a career, I have a house, I have a wife, I have the car, I have a motorhome, I have a pension, I have all of the things that life is supposed to be full of, right? And so what I don't have, I'm not one of those people and I don't have those problems.
The
R-
stereotype,
Correct.
quote unquote, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so if we start to get into it though, what you'll find is the system in itself, right? The family system in itself, there's probably some people in that family system who do not feel that way.
Mm,
They do
mm.
not feel like they say, "Hey, you know what? Yeah, you do all of those things." And then come 5 o'clock every day, when you get home, you are checked out. We don't get to see you, we don't get to hear from you, we don't get to talk to you. And when we do, it's likely very unpleasant because you're not present. You're, drunk, so to speak. Maybe you're not falling down drunk and all of those things, and maybe you're not abusive. But let's think about it. People know when people are in an altered state.
Altered.
Yep,
That's exactly what I was gonna say. It's an altered state and it
they're
takes
not healing.
away from
Yes,
being present. Yeah.
yes,
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Would you say, just sort of, because we're now moving into sort of this mental and emotional aspect, would you say that addiction always comes from visible, kind of like macro style traumas, and or like stories that where it's really visible, like your story, you have like these
right,
really pronounced
correct.
things that happened at a very young age. Do you see that mostly, or is there some really kind of uh, kind of covert, not so in your face experiences as a child or as an adolescent that sort of then become something bigger?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that there has to be these big traumatic events in people's lives that necessarily lead them to addiction, right? I've dealt with plenty of people who say, I never had an adverse childhood. I never had any of these things happen to me. I had everything that I've ever needed. I had great parents. I still have great parents. I have a good career. I have a good relationship with my wife. Um, but there's something that happens when I drink, right? We
Yeah.
see it all the time. I mean, you look at people all the time who have what we would think or what appears to be a very good life with, all of the things required to move forward in this life. And you look at them and they still can't manage because when they drink, something different happens. So there is no one thing that gets people to addiction.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what it seems like. I mean, it seems like there's so many variations and it's not black or white.
Oh,
And that's why I think every individual situation has to be looked at as an individual situation, because when you start to compare,
yep,
you start to put
yep,
yourself in the tendency to put yourself in the yes or no category, is strong, right? It's like, oh, well, I'm not like him or I'm not like her. So, no, this is not me, right? But
right.
there's just all these different examples, facets. It's very layered. It could be kind of complex, but I think there's this deep down potential knowing. Maybe you can probably answer that more than I can. When someone really does know that there is something off, even if it doesn't appear to the masses that something is off, would you say that most people sort of know that there is an issue if they
Yeah.
have one?
I would say so, right? When we look at addiction, it's the one thing that truly has no bias or prejudice. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter where you came from, how much money you have, how much money you don't have, who your parents are, who your parents aren't, what color you are, what color you aren't. Like it cares nothing about any of that stuff,
No
right?
bounds.
And so none. And so when you look at that internal conflict of what people may or may not be going through, it often has to do with is what you're doing going against your own moral integrities? Is it pressing against your own values? Are you doing things that you said you would never do? Do you just not feel in line with your own beliefs?
Mm.
And that's that internal conflict that people will go through, um, to the point where they're just not able to manage or do the things necessary.
Yeah. You know, you work with a lot of people, I think that, and this is going to be said. We haven't even really said it out loud. It's kind of funny to this point, but this will be said in the introduction, so people will already have known what you do specifically in terms of the group of people that you work with. But for people who are first responders, in police, law enforcement, all that specifically, um, can you talk a little bit about PTSD and how it is such a big component? And I realize it's all sort of blended in terms of what we've been talking about, right? Like it's very much blended into all the things that you've said so far, but just specifically, if someone is diagnosed, quote unquote, with PTSD, sometimes how addiction comes hand in hand with that.
Yeah, and so when you look at, contributing factors, right? We talked a little bit about those pieces, right? That contributing factors to what might get somebody to addiction faster than if they didn't have these things happen. So when we talk about post-traumatic stress, right? And what happens to people who deal with PTS, we talked a little bit earlier about looking for relief, right? And so, the population that I work with in specific is first responders. And so when you look at how first responders deal with trauma, they're very much people who are going to keep things inside. They're not going to let anybody know that they're hurting or what they've experienced is difficult to deal with for a number of reasons, whether it's just the sheer stigma of how it is or just the fear of being vulnerable and how they'll be seen from the public and their peers if they actually talk about the fact that they're struggling, right? And so when you look at how it is that they may potentially start to look for relief, oftentimes you're going to find that somebody who is law enforcement or somebody who works for the fire department, they're not oftentimes going to seek out illegal drugs. They're not going to do things to jeopardize other people's lives or their own, right? So they're probably going to look for relief in what is legal and what is available,
And
and
accepted.
accepted, and
Yeah.
that's alcohol. You have a hard shift, you have a tough call, you start drinking, right? I mean, listen, I think every one of us has seen a movie or a TV show where a couple of law enforcement officers or detectives or whatever it is just had a really tough call, and where do they go?
Yeah.
They go to the bar and they start drinking. Or, the scene in the movie where they're sitting down and they're pouring each other a drink or they're having a beer, right? So it's this socially accepted thing that is available. And so when the brain is looking for relief in the ways of that, you start to pick that stuff up. And there's a number of things that we could look at after that. Again, you look at the amount of people who maybe that they're okay with that, and having a beer here and there after a tough call has worked for them. Okay, great. But what about the people who have the genetic predisposition,
Mm.
right? Again, I talked about the things in my story not being what made me alcoholic. They were just contributing factors. And so post traumatic stress may very well be a contributing factor to get somebody to addiction faster. And when working with this population, we find that that's often why they've reached for the bottle, for lack of a better term, or for the exact term, right? Is that they're looking for that relief. They're looking to shut the brain off. They're looking to go to sleep. Somebody who's suffering from post traumatic stress oftentimes is not sleeping well. So they're looking to sleep. And the thing about, drugs and alcohol is that they work until they don't work.
Right.
Alcohol is very effective in making us feel calm. Alcohol can be very effective in helping somebody get to sleep. And so they work until they don't work. And what happens is if the post traumatic stress isn't dealt with, this quote unquote underlying issue, um, then the person is going to continue to reach for this substance that's helping provide some relief. And if they do that for a prolonged period of time, they will become dependent. It doesn't matter, again, if you become alcoholic, you will become dependent. And dependency comes with a number of symptoms that include, inability to manage feelings, right? Um, Withdrawal. I mean, there's just so many things that happen to a person when they become dependent. And I think most people think of alcohol dependency as, um, you know, somebody who's got to go to detox and all those things, and they're sick all the time, and they drink and they drink and they drink. And while that might be true, it is not true for everybody. When you look at very high functioning people that may very well be dependent on alcohol, maybe it's not yet a physical dependency, but more of an emotional and a mental dependency that gets them through and is a way that they cope. It is their number one coping mechanism to get them through the next day, the next call, the next whatever it is that they're dealing with. And so if we can get to those underlying facts and help them heal from the post traumatic stress, a lot of times we see that people can get sober and find out that, hey, you know what, they never really had this overly looming alcohol addiction to begin with. They were actually just trying to manage their mental health.
Right.
Also see people that are the exact opposite. That is, the mental health contributed to, the post traumatic stress contributed to, they begin to drink, and before they knew it, it woke up that alcoholic gene, and now they realize that they're alcoholic.
I think it's really important that you just sort of separated the difference and what it could be, because I think that is just there's a lot of gray area here, and I think that it creates a lot of confusion, both like I said earlier, both for the person that might be having the problem and also for the people around. And I think that there's this element too that starts to how do I say, take place within family dynamics. And that's sort of where I want to go to next, and really focus on, the people who are in the situation with the person, and how there's manipulation or unintentional manipulation that can
Yeah.
be created, because I think we see that a lot. I think there's probably a lot of ego and pride that could potentially float to the surface, especially, well, both from both ends, but especially from the person who's challenged or suffering, and just the common feelings that I think the person that is suffering, uh, their loved ones, like what they are starting to feel, how they are dealing, and how they're coping, because that's a whole nother realm. And that I think that spouses, siblings, children almost tend to get lost a little bit, because the problem is, quote unquote, not
Yes.
them, but they're suffering just as much in a way. So let's touch on that aspect.
Yeah, and so when you can look at, right, the system as a whole, right, the family system, and you can kind of look at some different roles that people play within a chemically dependent family, right? You have the primary person, right? The person who's either suffering from mental health or alcohol addiction or drug addiction, right? The addict, the alcoholic, the the problem drinker, however it is that those patterns have shown up in their lives, right? So you have that person, and then you have these different roles that could potentially take place within the unit. And so you have, typically after that, you'll look at somebody who plays a part, what we like to call um, the chief enabler. And when I look at like the word codependency, it's really this umbrella term for some other things that we could look at, right? So I think break it up into these kind of sub roles where you look at, the protector, the caretaker, the worrier, right? These are maybe some sub roles that people play, um, rather than just saying, "Oh, well, this person's codependent." Well, maybe they just have this protective piece about them that they're trying to manage. And maybe there is some codependency involved, but there's also maybe a caretaking piece, right? Maybe they're just a very caring person and they're trying to navigate this relationship. And it can be very difficult when you're involved with somebody who has these patterns of alcohol abuse and these sorts of things. Um, and so you have to begin to look at how it is that you manage or um, kind of get into your own patterns and behaviors,
Mm,
right? Because you can essentially what happens is a person can become so enmeshed in this relationship that that person who's suffering from the addiction becomes the enabler's drink or drug, right? They
wow.
are, yeah, they become that same thing for the person, right? And oftentimes they can be dealing with the same sorts of things, right? They're dealing with their own anxieties and their own depressions and their own insecurities. Sometimes maybe they're even dealing with their own drinking issues as a result of trying to manage life with this person who's struggling. And so there can be a lot of pieces to that puzzle and how it is that we begin to separate those things. And so you can really kind of look at it in the ways of, am I doing something for somebody that they could and should be doing for themselves? Right? Am I so enmeshed in this person's life that I don't look at their ability to be able to manage things? I take responsibility for everything. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells because I don't know who's going to show up. Am I going to get the good version of them, the bad version of them, the mad version of them? Like, who's showing up? I don't know.
That's a lot of trauma too, just to go through that.
100%.
Yeah.
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 No, 100%. And it to truly treat substance abuse or any addiction, we have to treat the family, right? We have to be able to look at things on a holistic level, right? The whole unit, and be able to understand that the person who's dealing directly with the substance abuse is just one part of that.
Yeah.
The spouse, the significant other, they're dealing with it as well. If there's kids involved, the kids are dealing with it as well, right? Like there's patterns and behaviors and things that happen over time that affect everybody in that unit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow. It's I don't have this experience firsthand, but I do know people who are in this position, and I think it could be so overwhelming. And I really was just moved by what you said earlier. It's almost like this, say the spouse as an example, right? Say it's a wife who's married to the husband, who has the issue. The wife might almost um, become addicted in a way to managing the situation.
absolutely.
It's like there's this whole other addiction component, and it has nothing to do with substance. It has to just do with behavior, right? And in that in itself, it's just, you're right. There's such a unit component, and it's not. There's no blame here, right?
No,
There's no blame here. It's just kind of what tends to happen, especially when people love each other and care for one another and want people to be better. I mean, the inherent feelings are there, right? It's like, I just want the situation to be resolved. I just want this person to feel better. I just
yeah,
want to have a cohesive relationship. I just want to live in peace. I want them to live in peace. But there tends to be all of this, the dysfunction. It might start in one area, but it bleeds into other areas. You know?
absolutely.
Yeah.
When you look at that family unit, right, you can look at it much like a mobile that hangs over a baby's crib, right?
Mm.
They're individual pieces that are interconnected, meaning if I flick one, the whole thing is affected. Although they're individual pieces, they're still connected together, right? And so if you look at those pieces that you're talking about in the ways that how somebody becomes kind of addicted to that relationship. When you look at how um, person who's dealing with addiction uh, is in a survival mode. We talked about how the brain kind of switches over to survival and it's been hijacked. In the unit, the family unit, the primary goal is survival. So these people adapt and adopt roles with the goal of survival for the family unit. They're trying to do everything that they can to keep the unit together. And if that means that they have to manage other pieces of this person's life, like sometimes the spouse will have to take on the finances because right? And if we use the kind of traditional husband and wife kind of
Sure.
explanation, the husband used to take care of all the finances and do all of the
Mm,
things, but as he's become more and more stressed out and his addiction has kind of gained more and more momentum, maybe now the wife is taking on the responsibility of the finances because he can't just seem to manage them. Maybe now she's telling people outside of the family that unfortunately we're not going to be able to make it. You know, Ralph is not
mm.
feeling well. He's got to work more. But what she's actually doing is making up excuses because
Covering.
he can't seem to manage his drinking. He has decided today, instead of going to a family barbecue, I'm going to stay home and cut the grass and drink beer. Right. And so she's calling in those sorts of things. Maybe she's calling in to work. Maybe she's managing the kids more. She's kind of lost a partner and picked up all of these responsibilities. And the goal in doing that is to do what? Keep the family intact. And it's for survival, and so there's so much that happens within that and shifting over. And we're doing a lot in the ways of not allowing the natural consequence of somebody's actions, right, to happen, by softening the blow. Which I
Mm.
understand it can be difficult. It can be very difficult to hold boundaries and do those things, especially, people will often say, well, how am I supposed to have boundaries, when ultimately it's the kids' lives that are at stake or it's the financials that are at stake. And listen, I won't argue with you about whether or not that's difficult or hard. It absolutely is hard, but understanding that in order to make life and deal with life on life's terms, we have to do the hard thing. We do hard things, right? And in order to hold boundaries, sometimes it's going to be difficult. It's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to have to face things that you don't want to face, right? And that absolutely. Absolutely, it's difficult. It is the hard thing to do. But it's also the understanding that the avoidance of not doing those things, the avoidance of not having those conversations, the fear that has kept you in the space that you're in will only perpetuate the life that you have now, and things will only get worse, right? The consequences on the side of the addicted person will only get worse.
I absolutely love what you just said. I mean, because I just feel like this is so important to hear. Like the way that you articulated that just now was just excellent in every way. And what came to my mind was, isn't it interesting just putting myself in a position, say, of a loved one, right? How you can hold the enabling behavior in one hand and the resentment in the other and still walk forward with both,
Yeah.
right? Because there is this tug of war going on. There's this tug of war to keep the unit together, to do the thing, to make things work to the best of your ability, and also have this background of unforgiveness and resentment and all this stuff that builds up. And I think that I'm going to thread this into the next part I want to go, which is the spiritual component. But what makes what just makes my heart swell with, just care is how difficult that must be. And I don't think we just see this in addictions. I think we see this in family units, even who are just having tough times, right? Like with,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's not, we're not, we see these behaviors in a lot of different families for a lot of different reasons. But it must be so difficult. And I guess, hold space for that situation because of just how hard it is. I don't even know how else to further say it.
It's extremely hard, and you'll hear me say this again. We do hard things,
Yeah.
and I'll talk to you a little bit about that, and bring some things to light on that. But I think it's important to understand that when we shift from who is wrong to what is wrong,
Ooh.
right? When we are in a space of who is wrong, this is putting blame and shame and guilt and all of the things on a single person, which means that I'm making that person responsible for all of solving all of the problems and bringing all the happiness to the unit, right? To the family unit. When the reality is everyone in that unit has a responsibility and a part in what's going on. And when we can better understand what our part in that is, we can better manage together the unit. We shift over from what is wrong, not who is wrong. Who is wrong says you're the problem, you have this addiction, you brought all this onto our family, you've done all of these things, right? You versus what is the actual problem? What is wrong? Well, what is wrong is that there's an addiction. What is wrong is that there's some resentment. What is wrong is that there's some enabling
Mm,
behaviors. What is wrong? And you go down the line and look at those things and understand where is my part in this and how can I better manage my part by not avoiding things and moving forward through things.
mm,
And that will bring me into a little piece that I like to when I counsel people. One of the things that I talk about is that we do hard things, and doing the hard thing isn't, doing the right thing isn't always easy. It oftentimes feels very, very difficult. And so, I learned through analogy and silly things and trivial things that stick in my head. And I learned not long ago about buffalo and the difference between cows and buffaloes. And I thought it was really important to and it really fit into this
mm,
idea of what it is that we're doing when we're in the healing process, right? So when you look at cows and how cows manage life, in cow life on the farm and all of those things, right? When storms come, cows will run. They will run the opposite way and they will do everything they can to not allow the storm to catch them, to the point where cows will literally run themselves to death. If there's not something to stop them, they will run from until they're exhausted, completely exhausted. And they still have to face the storm. The storm still catches them, right? And they're still stuck in having to deal with it. The only difference now is that they're exhausted, and they don't have the energy to do so. The American buffalo, on the other hand, learned early on, right, that if it turns and faces the storm and heads into the storm, it still has to deal with the storm. It still has to deal with it. It's very difficult. It's hard. It's all of those things. But it also learned early on to adapt and to survive. That if it moved into the storm, it could go through the storm and eventually get out on the other side. And while moving through the storm, it had the resources and the energy and the ability to take the storm on rather than run from it. And I think when we look at how it is that we deal with life and how it is that we deal with trauma, what is the easy thing to do?
run.
Avoid, 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 and run.
Yeah.
And we do. We avoid the simplest uncomfortable things. Human beings seek comfort over discomfort all the time. When the reality is holding those boundaries, having those difficult conversations, not allowing things to happen in our lives, facing the storm and having those things is what we need to do. And they're uncomfortable and they're difficult. But when we do that,
Mm,
we find that things become much more easier they become much better to manage,
yeah.
and it's
Down the
still
line.
very difficult. Yes.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, gosh, first of all, I want to say that I didn't know where you were going with the cow and the buffalo at
She's
first.
like, "Oh my gosh."
At
Yeah.
first, but then I remembered that I also read a story. about the cows and the buffalo. And so I thought, oh my gosh, this is actually something I know. And I love that you paralleled that because it's a perfect analogy in many ways, you know. And I think that this also brings me to everything that you're talking about, which is like basically who, not who is the problem. Oh, we can do hard things. Okay, so for those of you that are not watching but listening, he just picked up his water bottle, and on the water bottle it says we can do hard things, which I love.
It's got a little buffalo. I had it made for
Yeah, with the
myself.
buffalo. Yep,
Yeah.
that's awesome. So, you know, the whole like pointing the finger versus looking at the problem, right?
Yeah.
That brings me to the question. And I heard you actually describe this when you were speaking with someone else on another podcast. Um, the difference between guilt and shame. And you had such a clear, crisp, and direct explanation for how we should view guilt and shame when in a position of addiction or being someone who is, you know, is a loved one, but also not just addiction. I think in general it's a really beautiful explanation. So can you give that to us?
Yeah, I mean, when you're looking at guilt versus shame, right? And this isn't necessarily something that, I came up with, but
Right.
when you start doing research on it and you learn immediately what's the difference between guilt and shame, right? Guilt says I did something wrong, and shame says I am something wrong. Guilt says I did something bad, shame says I am something bad. And shame at its core is the most corrosive human emotion that we can experience.
Yeah.
When a person is stuck in a cycle of shame and they're unable to really see their worth, I am wrong at my core. I am bad. I am not good enough. I am not fill in the blank. And when a person is stuck in that, there's no ability to be able to get out of it. You're going to continue to really kind of sink deeper and deeper into these ideas of not being worthy, right?
Yeah.
And 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 what happens is, and especially in very high performing people, they go out into the world and they achieve all of these things, right? A lot of times they have what I call this wall of accolades, right? Where you can turn to the room in their house or the hallway in their house and you can see, or the office, wherever it is, right? You see the plaque with all of the diplomas, you see all of the degrees, you see all of the medals, you see all of the achievements, these accolades, these things in life that they have accomplished. But at the end of it, they look at those things and they don't see any amount of worth. And in fact, once they achieved the first thing, they went on to achieve the next thing because it did not fulfill that hole inside. Because at the core, what is running that whole deal is this shame, this idea that I am not good enough. So, therefore, no matter how much I achieve or how much I gain or gather in the world, at my core, I will never be enough because it is the core belief. And that's shame drives that. Shame loves perfectionism
Yeah.
because perfectionism is unobtainable. It will never be perfect. And so it sets us up to fail. There comes a point where people say, well, if it can't be perfect, then I won't do it at all. Where failure doesn't become an option because if I fail, then it just goes to prove that I'm not worthy or I'm not worth enough.
Yeah.
Guilt, on the other hand, is something that will drive people to change their behavior. Listen, this thing happened and I don't like the way that I felt about it. I'm not necessarily the thing that happened, right? Um, I don't internalize it as me being a bad person because I did those things. I just internalize it as bad behavior and it will motivate me to want to move forward.
Yeah. Beautifully said. I love it. And when I heard you say that the first time, I thought, I have got to have him say this way here because I just feel like it's crucial. And I think that's a perfect segue actually to start just to dive in just a little bit and ask you, because this is very much tied into shame and how we can deal with shame, I believe. Do you feel like there is a spiritual component to addiction? And is addiction a spiritual disease at its core?
Yeah. Yeah, and so if you go back to kind of some of the founders of treating um, addiction, alcoholism in specific, you look at AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Which believes that alcoholism is a mental obsession coupled with a physical allergy of the body and a spiritual malady, right? And so if you look at this mental obsession, right? The people that have struggle with addiction, they become obsessed about it. This physical allergy, these things happen to me when I drink that don't happen to normal people. And this spiritual malady, this lack of connection with a higher power of my understanding, right? And I think when we start to look only at self for the answers, you're only going to find the answers that self can create. And I think until you look outside of that, you're going to struggle. Is it a spiritual thing? Well, here's what I know. Personal experience has shown me that through the years, right? February 18th of 2006 was the last day that I ever drank or had any drugs of any sort. It'll be 18 years next month. What I know about that is that every single person along the way that I have met that has achieved long-term sobriety is has mentioned of God of their understanding. They have mentioned the spiritual piece to this. They have mentioned connecting with a power greater than themselves to guide them through. So my experience 100% has a spiritual component to it. It has a an idea of God, a God of my understanding, right? And that has absolutely been the cornerstone of what it is that I have in my life today. So when it comes to spirituality and people not believing in God or those sorts of things, listen, I'm not one that tells you that you have to believe in God. I can share with you my experience and I can put you on a quest to seek for yourself what that looks like.
Yeah.
And so I absolutely believe that spirituality is a cornerstone for someone to achieve life uh, of sobriety or a better life in general.
I was just going to say, uh, my belief is that it's a cornerstone for life i-
Yeah,
at all, right? I
absolutely.
mean, and again, not everybody has to agree with that, and that's the beauty of choice and free will. But
100%.
whether it's addiction, whether it's, addiction to other things, not just substance, but it could be anything or any trial or challenge that is disrupting or interrupting our life,
Yep.
uh, I believe that it is absolutely core and the I guess the root, but also the where the breakthrough is because God can lead you through it. And I think that the burden becomes easier over time once you start to experience His grace and His mercy and His love for you. And, that doesn't mean that your walk is going to be easy. It's not, it might actually even be harder, and you'll ask anyone who believes, they'll probably tell you that. But yeah, no matter what the thing is, right? Substance or not, or something else, I believe that it is the cornerstone too. So I'm right with you.
And again, it's I have my experience, and I can share with you my life without God, and I can share with you my life with God, and I
Yeah.
can tell you that there is completely two different paths in my life.
Yeah.
When I turned my will and my life over to a God of my understanding, things began to go in a direction that I had no idea they would ever go. I'm a guy who thought at the best in my life, the things to do were to drink, do drugs, have sex outside marriage, do all of these things that were just of the world, and do what I wanted to do when I wanted to do it. I ran my life completely into the ground, right?
Yeah.
You turn around and you look at where my life is today and the things that I'm afforded and the abilities that I have and what it is that I'm able to do day to day. The fact that I am in a position to help impact people's lives, and not just people, right? I get the honor and privilege to work with the heroes of our community, and I say that lightly, and I say heroes lightly because any first responders out there that are listening, I don't believe it's your responsibility to be a hero to our communities. You are men and women who have chosen to do a job that is very difficult. It's not your responsibility to be our heroes, and so I don't want to put that on you.
Mm.
But I get the ability to be able to meet with them every day and to help impact their lives and to help make their sacrifices worth something when they turn to ask for help. And I get to do that only because of a God in my life who has brought me from a place in this world to where I am today. He's taken all of those things that I went through. you know was there ever a point in my life where I thought, oh, God's just sharpening me up and forging me through the fire to get me to a position later in my life where I'll be able to do these great things? Absolutely not. It was the most miserable times in my life. A lot of times, right? It was some of the more painful things that I've ever gone through, and you can't understand in those moments what God's doing. But the minute that I took my hands off the wheel and surrendered my life to a God of my understanding, the plan became very, very clear to me. I don't do what I do today because it was my plan. I'll tell you that right now.
I was I was just gonna say, I don't think it was your, well, I know it wasn't your plan, but man, is his plan just so much better, so much
Oh,
better.
100%.
Oh,
Yes.
and it's funny because you just answered the question that I was going to ask you kind of off the cuff, which was, what's your favorite part about working with all these first responders? But I don't think that, unless you have something else to say, I don't think that that kind of answered it for me.
It's a beautiful thing,
Yeah.
to they are the first to help and the last to seek help. And
Yeah.
me being in a position to answer that call when they do reach for help is a true honor and a privilege. And it's something that I value at my heart for a number of reasons. Um, but when you look at who they are and what they offer, whether it's our military or our first responders, they're truly people who have, chosen to sacrifice. And that goes along with their families. That doesn't come at a price. It's not just them that sacrifices, their families sacrifice too. These men and women work really, really long hours and they're exposed to horrible things. And that takes a toll on the family. And so to be a part of an organization and a member of a team, a leader in the team, to be able to help these men and women, it's just an honor. It really is. And it's something that has just brought me so much pain and joy at the same time.
Yeah.
But it's an absolute blessing, and it's a privilege. I've worked in the mental health industry for almost 13 years now, and the past 5 to 6 years has been specifically treating first responders. And while everybody deserves help, it's something about this population. It's just so special to be a part of.
Yeah.
Um, it really is. It's
Because I think they exude care. They're
Yeah,
such givers, and all you want to do is give back to them, and allow for healing to take place. And not and and to I'm sure see the process that a lot of them go through. Is just amazing and probably really difficult and hard at times. But are you? Is
my
it?
wife
Should we
came
just
in
tell?
here, opened
Should
the
we?
garage, rattled the dog. Like we're this
We're
close.
this close. We're this, but we should just for fun. I'm not going to edit this out. I'm going to just share it. So Reagan is in there. What do you want to tell
Yeah,
everybody who Reagan is?
sure. Reagan, come here. Let's see if we can get him. Come here, bud.
Yeah,
Shh.
this is going to stay on here so we can. Oh my gosh, I can only see it. Oh, there he is. Oh, okay. You guys just have to check out YouTube just to see Reagan.
Yeah.
You want?
So
Yeah.
he's a therapy dog that works with me. We do
Yep.
canine assisted therapy. He's a facility dog. He gets to hang out with the men and women there, and provide some everything from comical relief to emotional support to Some of them, whether it's professionally or personally, they work with dogs or they have dogs at home, and they can't necessarily bring them when they're in our facility. So he's there to kind of help them. And if you know anything about dogs and you're a dog person, you understand what that's like. His ability to be able to just brighten up a room. Two things that I've really seen, um to,
He's got to make himself known now.
yeah, to kind of change a big tough first responder is a dog and a baby. You
Oh,
know,
and right.
dog comes in the room and they change, man. They light
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
Somebody comes in with a baby, or you see one of these guys with their kids or grandkids, and they just change.
Yeah.
And so it's a blessing to be able to have him with us there. And he loves going there, and he was doing a great job just laying here minding
I
his own
know.
business.
I know. If you
My
guys could
wife thought I
hear.
was in the bedroom, and
Yeah.
so, "Come here, you be quiet." Um, but I'm in the garage, so she came to open the door, and now he's
I know. If
sometimes
you,
he gets mixed up between security and therapy,
I
so
was gonna say no. He's so cool. I love it. I love it, and I'm all about it. You know I have two over here, but they're not. They're like the small yappers who have to be tucked away during my recordings here.
he's a big boy.
Oh my gosh. I hope you guys just go check out the end of the YouTube episode just so you can see Reagan. Hi, Reagan.
Hello.
Yeah, if you guys could hear Chris on and off, he was kind of like, he would go and like kind of pet him, or if you could hear the little shifting, that's what was going on. Was that Reagan was walking back and forth or trying to get Chris's
Yeah.
attention. So anyway, so as we kind of taper down, I guess my biggest question, moving forward, is what would you say if somebody is listening and either has a either is in a position of concern for themselves or somebody who is a family member? What would you say to them? Where would you point them? What would the first steps look like? Because at the end of the day, this is about tangible solutions. And I realize this might be something that people stew on or think about or tuck
Sure.
away, or there's a seed planted. But just a tangible takeaway for people who need help. What would you say to that?
I mean, I think there's a lot of things. There's tons of resources out there. Obviously, if you're a first responder and you're hearing this, or you're family members of a first responder, my information will be available. We'll attach the link to our website, and we can just start answering questions. I think for family members, it's important to start to look out for local resources. And again, you're welcome to contact me. Let's start questioning some things and see where people are at. Right. Let's get to a position of being able to explore and inquire about what's going on. Let's learn as much as we can learn about the situations. If you're a person, that you're struggling, and you really want some help, find some people around you that you can just start talking to. So you got to start being honest with somebody about what's going on. More times than not, we don't think that we have resources, or we don't think that we have people around us. And it's just the mind placing you in a position. It's not true. It's not true. More times than not, there are so many people out there willing to help. You just got to start asking, just start talking to people, questioning things. Um, you have to start getting honest with yourself. Do that hard thing. Sit down with yourself and start to ask yourself, right? I mean, you could simply go online. Alcoholics Anonymous has a quiz. It's probably 20 questions, right? It says, to answer about whether or not you're an alcoholic, right? Ask yourself some simple questions, right? Can I stop?
Yeah.
Have I tried to cut back or manage my drinking and been unable to, right? Does drinking cause problems in my life? That which causes a problem is a problem, right? Start looking at better ways to manage those things. And it's not about shame or blame. I think everyone needs to understand that as human beings, we're fallible and we're going to make mistakes. As first responders, you're not responsible to be perfect. As human beings, we're not responsible to be perfect. I think we just have to get to a position of being willing to want to do something different. You want the resources, I promise you, not only will you provide them a handful of resources that we can use on the there's some
Reagan.
but you could just start Googling, and
Yeah.
I guarantee you're going to find the resources that you need. You have to get to a position of being willing to start to look at what's going on.
And I think that's the ticket right there is willingness, and willingness to, even if you are a loved one. And also, you said something that was really important that I just want to put us an exclamation mark on, as we tie up, which is that you don't have to believe, don't believe all the thoughts you're having.
No.
The fact that you said there's not enough out there for me, or a big one I think is I'm lost for, like, I'm a lost cause. That is not true, and that is your brain. That is not the truth. And so all of your thoughts are not true. you know we can feel or think a lot of things that are not true. And I think that that's really important for those listening, honestly, despite issue. But in this particular situation, there's a sometimes I think a veil or a blindness that can come over us, and we tend to believe everything that we think and feel. And the truth is that you are made to heal, and you can get there. If there's a willingness. And again, if you're somebody who needs support, if you're a family member, or it could be anybody, like a child of
Yeah,
an alcoholic parent. It could be a spouse. It could be a friend. There's hope for you too. You know, it's never
absolutely.
lost. It's never
No.
lost. So I will put all of the information in the show notes. And, again, if you are a first responder, please, please reach out to Chris at First Responder Wellness. Is there anything else that you want to add before we close?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity, and hopefully something that was said here resonates with people, and people understand that there is a way out, and it as cliche as it sounds, it starts with that first step, and that first step oftentimes is just admitting that there are things that are happening that revolve around drinking or drugs or whatever the addiction might be, um, and that we just need to take that first step.
Yeah, I love that. There's always hope. There's always hope.
Yeah.
It's never lost, even if it doesn't feel that way,
Right.
but feelings are not facts.
They are not, in fact, facts, neutral thinking is beautiful in that aspect where we just bring in the facts. And the other thing that I'll tell you is make the decision before the decision is made for you. Because if you are struggling and you continue down the road that you're on, it's just a matter of time before those things start to happen they're going to be consequential to your life, and it's not
Yeah.
going to be a good thing.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Well, my friend, this has been amazing. I think that it's valuable. I think it's necessary. I think it's needed. As I was telling you off air, I think there's a real need for more chats like this in the wellness space in particular. I think that there's a lot of focus on a lot of different things, but we just don't still to this day see addiction with substance and alcohol, all of this spoken, and it's just not spoken about enough, in my opinion, at least from what I have seen. So I am so thankful. Thank you for taking the time
Absolutely.
to sit
Yeah.
with me. I appreciate it. Thank you, Reagan, for
Yay,
joining us
buddy.
today, buddy.
It's
Yeah, he's just a ham. He's a big ham.
He
But
is.
it really has been an absolute pleasure. Well, thank you again. I appreciate you, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right.